All right, hi guys. Scrapple got a haircut and he looks really, really nice. He'd really appreciate it if you told him, Scrapple, you have a nice haircut. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, bye-bye, Scrapple. Today we're going to talk about unions and workers' rights. Union is a group representing workers in some company or companies or industry or industries that bargain collectively for better wages, for better hours, for better working conditions, and for benefits. So, if I were not a union member and I wanted to bargain with my employer over the exact terms or conditions or compensation for my employment, I wouldn't have a ton of power, right? Because I'm just some guy, and there are a million people behind me who could do my job. But if I'm represented by a union, and the union sort of represents all of its employees and can, for example, call its employees to strike or stop work at some point or otherwise somehow make trouble for the company, the union has leverage against the company. It has bargaining power, which it wouldn't otherwise have. Okay. So this is what a union is. This is the main idea about how unions work. But let's get a little bit of background here. So in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in the United States, work was worse than it is today, at least for a lot of people. Wages were low, work was dangerous, and hours were long. So to substantiate that, here's a little bit of greatest hits of labor history facts. So by one estimate, the average worker in the manufacturing industry in the United States in 1890 worked a 60-hour week. That's 12 hours a day if you're working 5 days a week, or 10 hours a day if you're working 6 days a week. In 1896 in Chicago, which was a period of time that was important in the development of teachers' unions around the country, the maximum salary for an elementary school teacher in Chicago was $500 a year, or a little bit more than $15,500 in 2019 dollars, adjusting for inflation. Classes at the time had as many as 60 students. So, imagine being a kindergarten teacher and you're getting paid $15,000 a year or less, and you have to deal with 60 5-year-olds at a time. It's a tough job, and it's poorly paid. There aren't a lot of statistics from this time about workplace deaths. The United States as a whole didn't keep tabs on how many people were being injured or killed on the job. But in one striking figure is that in Allegheny County alone, this is the county in Pennsylvania that contains Pittsburgh, which is a steel town, 526 people died from work accidents from July 1906 to June 1907. Only, I think, 125 of those people were steel workers themselves. So, which is frankly kind of surprising. You'd think that, steel work is an especially dangerous job, but actually all sorts of people were doing dangerous jobs in Pittsburgh at the time. One moment in labor history which was sort of especially galvanizing or especially outrageous was something that you might have heard of in your history classes, especially if you ever took a class that focused on the history of New York City. And this is the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. So in 1911, in New York City, well, at the time, New York City was largely a textile-based economy. The city made clothes and made fabric and shipped it around the United States. It was a textile city. And a lot of the work done in textile companies was done by immigrants and women. And so the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was a factory downtown. It's in a building which still exists. It's part of the NYU campus now. And in this factory, the bosses wanted to make sure that the women who were working at this factory worked all day, that they didn't take unnecessary breaks, or that they didn't try to, scam their managers and, try to get paid for work they weren't doing. So the way they ensured that people would work all day is that they locked the doors to the workplace. And one day in 1911, a fire broke out in the factory, and 146 people died. There were a number of just really shocking and gruesome scenes that came out of this, a little reminiscent of September 11th in a little bit closer to our own time. And so many people died. This is one of the deadliest accidents, if you could call it an accident, in the history of industry in the United States. And this really got people to wake up to see just how dangerous workplaces had become, and how little power workers had over the nature of their own work and the circumstances under which they worked. Now, labor activism, people trying to form unions, people encouraging workers to go on strike, has a history in the United States that goes back further than this, that goes back to the middle of the 19th century. Really around the time of the Industrial Revolution is when labor activism takes off. And labor activism in particular is often violently suppressed, sometimes by the police, sometimes by private security forces which were hired by corporations. So Carnegie Steel was behind the Homestead Mill strike. It was a strike among workers at a steel mill operated by Carnegie Steel. They were striking for better wages and better working conditions and better hours. And the Carnegie Steel called in the Pinkertons, who are a sort of privatized precursor to the FBI. And the Pinkertons came in and killed a bunch of people, shot a bunch of people. There was the Haymarket Affair, or the Haymarket Riots in Chicago, which led to a number of people being killed by the police. There was the Ford Hunger March. Ford Motor Company was notorious for beating up labor activists. The Hunger March was during the Great Depression, so leading up to the passage of the National Labor Relations Act, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So there's a long history of violently suppressing labor activism in the United States. Okay, so here's a little bit of background. You might ask, though, this is in the past. I mean, we don't live in 1911 or even 1932 anymore. What's the point of having a union around today? Well, I think there are a few reasons we might list why it might be a good idea for workers at a particular, I'm not saying every worker everywhere, but for workers at a particular workplace to unionize. So, unions can help prevent or mitigate or give workers some kind of recourse in the face of various forms of workplace abuse. So if your employer is withholding wages from you, if you're dealing with wage theft, if you have sexual harassment problems at your workplace, if your workplace is abusive in one way or another, individual workers can feel disempowered. Individual workers can feel like they don't have anybody they can talk to. They don't have anybody who's sympathetic to them. They don't have anybody who can listen to them. But if you have a union and you're dealing with one of these problems, you can talk to the union, and the union will help you. So Brooklyn College doesn't do this, but in other or doesn't have an especially bad track record of doing this. But in other CUNY campuses, have a nasty history of not paying teachers for the first few weeks of their work. So some CUNY campuses are notorious for losing the paperwork for new teachers and just not paying them for the first, say month and a half or 2 months of work. And this happened to a friend of mine who was working at one such campus, and if she weren't unionized, it's not clear what she would have done, but she was unionized. She went to our union. She said, my boss is saying that they won't pay me for the first 2 months of work because some piece of paperwork hasn't been processed, and the union helped her deal with it. They got her paid. Okay, so that's one reason why workers might want to unionize. That gives them some recourse in the face of workplace abuse and can help prevent that workplace abuse because, your boss might not be as eager to sexually harass you if, for example, your boss knows that you could call up the union and that your boss would have hell to pay. So unions could help improve unsafe working conditions. So if you're on a union job and you see that some site is sort of dealt with in an unsafe way, you can help. Unions give you some sort of recourse. They give you some leverage. They can help. They can help you improve the safety at your workplace. Okay. Union jobs, well, this is perhaps a double-edged sword, but union jobs are also harder to fire people from. So usually we have in the United States what's called employment at will. So you can be, in most jobs, fired for just about any reason or no reason at all at any time. So there are a handful of exceptions to this, which I don't know if we talked about it in class, but Anderson talks about it briefly in the Private Government book. There are a handful of exceptions to this. You can't be fired for racially discriminatory reasons or for sex discrimination or for trying to form a union, for example. But you can, in general, be fired for little or no reason at any time. But usually, unions work out employment agreements that make it harder to fire people. You need to terminate people for cause. You need one of a list of good enough reasons. You need an excuse to fire people. And in a time when, we might talk about this more later in the semester, but in a time when people are working increasingly precariously, people are working in jobs where they don't know where their next hours are going to, what their hours are going to look like next week. They don't know how long they'll be able to stay in the jobs that they have. Job security seems like something that's increasingly valuable. So, if you're an Uber driver, you don't know how many rides you're going to get from if you go out at any given time. If you're an Amazon Flex worker, say you might only know what your job is going to look like for the next 24 hours, or you might go from a series of sort of temporary gigs, one to the next. We know about this in academia because the majority of professors in the United States and in Brooklyn College and CUNY in particular are adjunct professors. We all work at least nominally part-time. So the union has helped secure us employment contracts which can guarantee that we'll have work for the next couple of years, at least for many of us. But there's still a feeling that if you're an adjunct, you're kind of on the razor's edge. You're never quite sure of whether you're going to be fired. And I don't think this happens for me, but I know some adjuncts, for example, are worried about, say, what they say in class or grading students too harshly. So, maybe this student, never showed up to class, and when they did, they were always stoned or something. But, I don't want to fail them for the class because, they're going to raise a complaint and then I'm going to get fired. Again, I don't feel that way. I don't feel pressured by Brooklyn College in this way, but I know plenty of adjuncts who do feel this way about their jobs. Okay, so requiring termination for cause and giving people some job security is one advantage of unions, especially in an age when people work increasingly precariously, not knowing where their next paycheck is going to come from or what their hours are going to look like from week to week. Another sort of advantage of unionization, or sort of set of advantages of unionization or benefits of unionization, are indirect benefits to non-union workers and to people outside the workforce altogether. So, historically, unions bargaining for the 5-day work week, the 8-hour work day, have essentially secured those basic benefits, basic advantages for all workers everywhere, for workers throughout whole industries, including non-union workers. So, when unions advocate for a 5-day work week and enough unions secure that, I don't want to call it a benefit, it would secure that victory. Well, all of a sudden, even non-union workers, and so employers say, yeah, okay, we'll just give you the 5-day work week as well, or non-union workers will say, hey, we're going to unionize unless you give us the 5-day work week, unless you give us the 8-hour work day. It just becomes a sort of norm or prevailing practice in an industry. Okay, so historically, the times in the United States, post-war period in particular, that have seen the highest union density, the highest percentage of members of the workforce in unions, have also seen the highest wages. So so wages grow when there's high union density in an industry. Wages grow not just for union workers, but also generally for non-union workers. Okay. So lastly, there can be indirect benefits of unionization to people who aren't necessarily workers at all. So this is when workers when a union bargain for hours and benefits and working conditions for themselves, they can also bargain for other benefits that attach to members of their community. Because if they do that, they can win the support of their community, and that sort of gives them some strength in their fight. The wave of teacher strikes a couple of years ago throughout the United States saw a lot of this sort of strategic bargaining for benefits to non-union members. So teachers' unions might bargain for lower class sizes, which would benefit them because they have fewer students to deal with. It's a less stressful work environment, but also the students, of course, will learn better in a classroom with 20 kids rather than a class with 60 kids. Union workers have also that wave of teacher strikes a couple of years ago, there was a lot of what's called bargaining for the common good, people bargaining for public recreation areas, people bargaining for mental health services for the local community, public health things, all sorts of advantages to that can sort of accrue to members of the community who are outside of the union. Okay, so that said, unions have, at least in recent history in the United States, I think the tide is sort of changing now, but in recent history in the United States, unions have had a bad rap. I think the one sort of historical explanation of this is that high union wages were blamed for the recession in the United States in the late 1970s, and there was a kind of anti-union backlash, and it's sort of stuck in place since then. So in studies of newspaper reporting about unions, the majority of stories about unions in the popular press, even in nominally liberal newspapers like the Washington Post or the New York Times or something like that, were negative. They were negative stories about union corruption and so forth. Okay, so unions have a bad rep. Is it deserved? Well, unions have caused certain harms in the past. There are dangers to unionization or dangers to that attend unions. So a union might give workers job security, and that's good for the workers, but, well, what if they're bad workers? What if this person is really bad for this job? When I was in elementary school, we had a gym teacher, and this gym teacher would sort of leer at the girls in the, especially in the 4th and 5th grade. Maybe he'd touch them, not on their reproductive organs or their breasts or anything like that, but, touch them in ways that were inappropriate or disturbing. He was, I think, at least on one occasion, at least that was the rumor, he was violent towards one of the students, and he was just generally sort of a dick. None of us wanted this gym teacher to be here. The parents didn't want the gym teacher to be there. But, it was really hard to fire this worker. In fact, the New York City public school system has a lot of problems. But one of the sort of more notorious features of the New York City public school system is what's called the White Room. So sometimes teachers who are really too dangerous to keep on the job, say because there are ongoing sexual harassment complaints against them, or because they've been abusive to students, or just been incompetent in one way or another, are sent to this place called the White Room. So where they have to report to work every day, but they don't actually go teach anywhere. So they go show up to work, spend it in this room in some office building somewhere for 8 hours a day, and then go home. And these people are on the city payroll. And so, this is an example of, it's widely believed, at least, to be an example of a situation where the union is protecting workers who really should be fired, who really have no business doing the job they were hired for. Okay. Unions have also sometimes engaged in protectionist behavior, so limiting the number of people who can work in some industry primarily to benefit a small group of people who are already working in that industry. I think some construction unions have been accused of this. So you have to know somebody who knows somebody in order to get into the union. It's really hard to get this union job. It would be better if there were more workers in this industry and the union were representing all of them. But the union has decided that it's best to represent the workers it already has and just let in a handful of new people every year. Okay. Arguably, this is of course controversial, but arguably police unions defending cops accused of police brutality or of murder or of rape are engaged in this sort of protectionist behavior. Okay, I think it's also worth pointing out that unions can be protectionist in another way, not that they limit access to employment in some industry, but also they can be protectionist in that they work for benefits to their own members that might, in some cases, negatively affect other people. I think an example of this, which is being discussed a lot right now, is that some unions, not all of them, and certainly not all union members, but some unions have been opposed to Medicare for All, the popular proposal to give all people in the United States health insurance funded by the government, so we don't have people who are going uninsured and dying of preventable illnesses because they can't afford to go see a doctor, or they can't afford their prescription drugs, or whatever it is. Medicare for all is a controversial proposal, but it's very, very, very popular. And some unions have opposed it. And I think, well, why would unions oppose a popular social program which would give benefits to everybody in the United States? And the answer in these cases is that, well, those unions have secured benefits for their members. And if everybody gets health insurance, then it's not in the interests of those. Then those unions are providing fewer benefits to their members. So members might drop out of the union, or agitate to pay lower union dues, or something like that. Now, it's my opinion that even if we pass Medicare for all, it would probably be a good thing for labor unions in the United States. They wouldn't have to argue for benefits which are tied to employment. They could argue for other things which are more properly or directly tied to employment. They could argue for things like better wages, or better hours, or better working conditions, the sort of core things that unions were initially designed to do. Okay, but that's just my opinion. Or rather, not that it's my opinion, it's an informed opinion. It's an educated prediction about how things would roll out, but it is, of course, a matter of some controversy. So, lastly, one of the main tools that unions have in bargaining with corporations, with whole industries, however it works, is striking. So a strike is when all of the members of a union, or some portion of the members of a union, stop working. They stop going into work, and usually they will work to prevent people from being hired ad hoc to fill in their jobs. This is the thought is that usually, perhaps as a contractual matter, the employer can't find enough workers to fill them in overnight, so the employer stops making money, stops benefiting from their labor overnight. Now, this is, in the National Labor Relations Act, which we're going to talk about in a second, this is one of the main justifications for the NLRA, is that they think we need people to strike as little as possible, because strikes are really, really disruptive to the economy. One strike to give an example of a strike which was really disruptive to the economy. So a few years ago, the longshoremen, a union representing some people who worked in shipping on the West Coast, who would help unload shipping containers that were being brought into San Francisco and other places, went on strike. And so these shipping containers were sort of sitting off the coast of California, waiting to be unloaded. And if you cut off shipping to the West Coast, I mean, that's a real serious disruption to the economy. By some estimates, this strike cost billions of dollars. Now, you might say, well, if the longshoremen's labor was so valuable, they should have just given in to their demands. They should have just paid the longshoremen whatever they wanted. If their work is that valuable, that's what they should have been paid. But you could say this strike was incredibly disruptive. This strike was, even if it had sort of long-term good consequences in some way or other, it was, in the short run, very, very costly to the United States as a whole. Okay, so this is one way that unions might be harmful, and I think when people criticize unions, this is economically disruptive strikes is one sort of thing that they point to. Okay. Just a little bit about the National Labor Relations Act. So this is the main law governing the relationships between employees and unions, or employees or unions and employers. The National Labor Relations Act doesn't just govern employees who are already unionized. So it makes it illegal to interfere with workers' attempts to unionize. There are some interesting questions about just what constitutes interference, but maybe we can set those aside for now. Those are largely legal questions, not so much moral questions, or not in the first instance moral questions. The National Labor Relations Act also guarantees that people can't be forced to join a union unless it's a condition of employment, where what that means is that, say you have some employer who has agreed to only work with union electricians, electricians who are members of the electricians union. So then nobody can be forced to join the electricians union, but if you work as an electrician for this business, then you have to be a member of the union. Now, throughout many states in the United States, a growing number of states have passed laws forbidding union membership as a condition of employment. These laws are called, frankly, I think this is sort of a dystopian name for these laws, but they're called right-to-work laws. So the right-to-work laws, the thought is that, well, people have a right to work as, say, electricians, even if they're not members of a union. Although, what the function of right-to-work laws is to weaken unions, to lower the dues that unions can collect, and thereby, indirectly, to lower the wages and benefits and bargaining power of the union and of workers in the industry in general. So what are called right-to-work laws are really laws which tend to undermine workers and worker wages. Okay. We might also talk about the Janus decision. So there was a recent Supreme Court decision a couple of years ago. The way that CUNY's union, for example, used to work, we're a public sector union. So most unionized workers in the United States work for the government, although something like 11 or 12%, something like that, of private sector workers work for unions. So UPS, for example, is a private sector employer whose workers are unionized. But the majority of union workers in the United States are in public sector unions. They're unions representing government workers. And so one thing, so the Professional Staff Congress, the union representing CUNY faculty, the way that it used to work is that, well, you could either agree to join the union or not to join the union when you came to work for CUNY, but either way, you had to pay effectively. You had to pay dues to the union so that the union could bargain on your behalf. So you could decide to join the union, and then you could vote in union elections and things like that, or you could not join the union. But either way, you had to pay. You had to pay for the union because the union was bargaining on your behalf. Okay, the union is working for your wages and your working conditions and so on. And but the Janus decision was a Supreme Court decision which made it the case that unless you were a member of a union, your union dues couldn't be subtracted from your paycheck. So that's no longer the case at CUNY, even though a lot of people have agreed to pay union dues. You can't your union dues can't be subtracted from your paycheck unless you agree to it or unless you're a member of the union. Okay. We should note that although the National Labor Relations Act, which was passed in 1935 and is still the law of the land, is still on the books, it has become increasingly difficult to enforce the National Labor Relations Act. This Walmart article is a case in point. This is a good example of this. So Walmart is doing all these things which, frankly, are obviously union busting. They're obviously preventing people from unionizing, shutting down stores where people threaten to unionize, shutting down sections of stores where people threaten to unionize. Walmart also is a notoriously bad employer. They pay people garbage money to do sometimes difficult, sometimes just boring jobs. They as the article showed, have sometimes locked people in the workplace overnight. This is as you might, if you recall, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, which we discussed at the beginning of this video. You know, if you think of the history of workers locking their employees in the store overnight, you know, it's not a happy one. And, you know, Walmart has gotten away with this because they're a very, very powerful corporation. So, you know, this is, you know, we've emphasized this point a little bit, but maybe haven't emphasized it enough, that what is legal and what is right are not the same thing. Sometimes there are things that you can get away with legally. Maybe it's not strictly Walmart isn't strictly following the letter of the law, but they're not going to be prosecuted for this, or they're, you know, the government is just not going to enforce a lot of NLRA. You know, Walmart has paid a lot of fines for its union busting activity and for wage theft and things like that, but the NLRA isn't going to treat Walmart too aggressively because they're such an enormous and powerful corporation. You know, similarly with other industries that are, you know, very powerful or very influential. But this is, I think, a real object lesson in the fact that what is right and what is legal are two separate things. So you might be legally able to get away with something. It doesn't make it morally okay. What about this? So, you know, there's not been a ton of philosophy in this lecture. That's okay. I just wanted to give a bit of this sort of background here and sort of talk about some of the relevant sort of values-related considerations that are involved when we're thinking about unionization and we're thinking about workers' rights. Questions about termination for cause, questions about relative bargaining power, questions about different ways that working collectively can help protect workers from the worst forms of workplace abuse and violence. But but you know, even if there hasn't been a lot of philosophy here, I think we should still sort of get at the upshot of this. You know, well, what does this mean practically? I think one thing to say is that relationships between unions and, this is a business ethics class, and you're in business school, and presumably you are going to go on to work in management in some way or other. And maybe you'll be an entrepreneur, you'll be a sole proprietor of some business. You'll be just an investor, and you won't be in management at all eventually. That's possible, but a lot of you, at least, are going into management in one way or another. And I think what you'll sort of learn culturally at a lot of workplaces is that the relationships between unions and management are always going to be hostile. And it's important to remember that unions, whatever the harms associated with unions in the past, we talked about strikes, we talked about protectionism, whatever harms are associated with unions or have been associated with unions in the past, unions exist for a reason. They exist to secure certain benefits secure certain advantages for workers, non-union workers, and other people, children in public schools and things like that. And there's a reason why employees want to unionize. I'll say if there's one thing to consider is that if it's really, really important to you from a managerial point of view that your workers don't unionize, say because it'll add a lot of bureaucratic red tape to all of your negotiations with employees, or because you feel like you might be pressured into employment agreements that you're going to have to renegotiate later in the future because you can't really pay them out or can't really afford them or something like that. I think the answer is that if it's really, really if it's really, really important to you from a managerial point of view that your workers don't unionize, the solution isn't to, like the Pinkertons or Ford Motor Company's security forces, like beating up all of your unionizing employees or trying to fire them, trying to violate the National Labor Relations Act. The answer is to think, well, why are they unionizing? What sorts of demands do they have? And can I, if it's really important to me that they not unionize, what can I do to satisfy those demands that will prevent them from unionizing? So if you think that unions are going to be a big problem, look to workers' demands rather than looking to, violence or suppression or borderline illegal activity to try to prevent workers from collectivizing in ways that you think are going to be dangerous. Okay, I think that's just about it for unions today. Oh yeah, well, if I have anything else to say, I'll send it in an email. Okay, good. Thanks a lot. Hope you're doing well.